The Avengers vs. the Peter Factor, My Personal Redo, by midnightwolf2192. Chapter 7, Bucky. When the rogue Avengers returned to Stark Tower, Pepper Potts and Happy Hogan were waiting for them on the landing pad, with a stack of files and frowns on their faces.
"Hello, Pepper,"
Steve said as the group disembarked from the Quinjet and walked over to the two people. Pepper's frown morphed into a glare as she looked Steve up and down. "It's Miss Potts to you, Mr. Rogers," Pepper said coldly, and the rogues tensed at the tone. Steve lowered his gaze and Pepper nodded satisfactorily. She then turned the rest of them with a stern glare. "We are here to give you the rundown on things, since you are moving back in."
"First rule, stay away from Tony's floor and his lab,"
Happy said firmly. All eyes turned to him.
"None of you have access to either location anyway, but don't even try to go there. Friday will not allow you access via either the elevator or the stairs."
Steve opened his mouth to say something, but shut it at the combined glare from Happy, Pepper, and, surprisingly, Nat.
"Second, stay away from Tony,"
Happy continued. Steve looked like he wanted to protest, but Bucky grabbed his arm.
"If Tony is in his lab, you will not go there. The only contact you will have with Tony is during an Avengers meeting, and even those are being scheduled through Pepper and Colonel Rhodes. If you have technology or gear requests, you submit them in writing to either myself or Pepper, and we will decide if Tony sees them. You absolutely will not attempt to corner Tony after a meeting or try to catch him unaware. Remember, Friday monitors everything, and she won't hesitate to tell me. If she tells me you have attempted anything, UN edict or not, I will throw you out on your ass myself."
"You have all been assigned to the same floor as before," Pepper took over the talk. "All of your rooms have remained the same. If you would like anything changed or need anything new, written requests are to be sent to myself or Colonel Rhodes."
"Miss Potts,"
Clint said softly, and Pepper turned to him. The Avengers noticed her gaze soften slightly.
"Well, Scott and I need to request permission to visit our families."
"Of course not," Pepper said, and both men sighed in relief. "We will ask that you let us know, so that if anyone in power asks, we can tell them that we definitely know of your whereabouts. But none of you are prisoners here."
"Thank you,"
Scott said softly, and Pepper nodded at them. "Level 85 is open for you and has been converted into a full-scale gym," Pepper continued. "The gym includes provisions for the super soldiers among you, as well as a blast-proof room for Miss Maximoff to practice on work on her powers. There is also a dance studio for Miss Romanoff, and a fully stocked shooting range. You are free to come and go from that level as much as you please."
"Thank you, Miss Potts,"
Wanda whispered. The young girl had her head down, and while Pepper felt a little sorry for her, she was still mad for how things had gone down.
"First thing, and it is more of a reiteration of the first two rules, stay away from Tony," Happy said firmly. "I cannot stress this any further. If Tony wants to see you, he will. But it will be done on his terms. You corner him or try to force him to see you, and you will see exactly why I was hired."
The bodyguard turned and walked away quickly from the group. No one had to know that he was due to pick up the kid right now. Happy could use some of Peter's positive energy. "Thank you for your time," Pepper said, ending the very one-sided conversation. The rogues nodded at her and started to file past her. As Bucky started to move, Pepper spoke again. "Sergeant Barnes, could I please speak with you alone for a moment?" Bucky nodded and indicated for Steve to go on. The other man looked hesitant, but at the joint glares from Natasha and Bucky, he sulkily walked into the elevator with the others.
"Yes, Mum?"
Bucky said, and Pepper raised an eyebrow. "I just wanted to tell you something in private," Pepper said, and Bucky felt his body tense. Maybe things would have been better if he had stayed in Wakanda. "Tony doesn't blame you, at least not anymore, for what happened in 91.
That floored the soldier.
He had been expecting to be met with a repulsor blast to the chest from Tony, and honestly, he probably deserved it.
But I killed them. I killed his mother,
Bucky said softly, and Pepper's stern face softened. No, Hydra did that. You were merely the tool. Pepper said, It's like with Miss Maximoff. Tony was just the tool. His weapons were used to kill her parents. He was the tool, but the ones who fired the missile were the ones who killed them. In your case, Hydra used you. They took you from those you loved and used you to harm others. It has taken some time, but he no longer blames you for the actions of Hydra.
Could you please?
Bucky said, but he stopped. He didn't know how to word this, but Pepper simply smiled comfortingly at him.
Please tell him again that I am sorry. And thank him. He didn't need to have us move in here, despite what the UN spiel was. He could have confined us to the compound upstate, or simply refused. I can't imagine anyone making Tony Stark do something he doesn't want to do. I will do what I can to make sure the others follow the rules.
Thank you, Sergeant, Pepper said. She led them over to the elevator, and when it arrived, both climbed in. When it reached the Avengers' floor, Pepper turned it back to Bucky before he could leave. When you go into your room, you'll find some things. Tony thought they might help you settle in and feel more comfortable. If you need anything, let me know. The doors opened and Bucky walked out onto the floor. Steve was waiting for him, but Bucky brushed him off. He walked into his room and found a large box waiting on his bed. Hesitantly, Bucky opened the box and gasped at what it contained. Inside was practically a gold mine of things from his past. He started pulling out items and found himself tearing up. Inside was some of his Mars jewelry. How Tony had gotten that he'd never know, as well as many photo albums. There was one dedicated to each of his sisters, while another was dedicated solely to his mother and father. The last album was dedicated to him and Steve, and Bucky couldn't help but sit heavily on the bed. Whatever Hydra had done had essentially wiped his memories of his family, and Shuri had only managed to bring a small amount back. The rest was fuzzy. But, right now, Bucky had a chance to try again. Next to each picture was a small written caption describing the picture, and Bucky felt tears welling in his eyes as he flicked through the pictures. When he had finished going through the box, Bucky asked Friday to send a simple thank you message to Pepper, which was received and passed on to Tony with a smile. 4 months passed by, and most of Bucky's time had been spent jogging his memories, keeping Steve away from Tony, and working out in the gym. The world had generally been well, so the Avengers were rarely needed for missions, which certainly suited Bucky. Bucky was running on the treadmill when he felt eyes on him. It was nothing new to Bucky, but it was odd that he was feeling this while in the Avengers' private gym. He slowed the treadmill down to a walk and cast his eyes around the room. On his second pass, he noticed a foot sticking out from behind the pile of punching bags. Bucky turned off the treadmill and slowly walked over to where the leg was. As he got closer, he could hear the scratching of a pencil moving furiously across a page. Bucky walked around the pile of punching bags and saw a teenage boy propped up against them, with books spread out around him. "Oh, hey, Mr. Winter Soldier Barnser," the boy said when he noticed Bucky standing over him, and the soldier couldn't stop the smirk that spread across his face. This must be the boy that he had overheard Natalia and Clint talking about. "Am I bothering you? Sorry if I interrupted your workout."
It's just Bucky, kid. And you're all good. What are you working on over here?
Bucky asked as he looked over at what the boy was working on. It looked to be blueprints, but Bucky couldn't figure out what for. "My engineering assignment," the boy replied. "We were randomly assigned an area of engineering, and we have to develop schematics for something related to that field. We also have to write a report about the item's function and how it will improve the area we were given. Of course, I had to get medical engineering. I couldn't have gotten robotics or mechanical. I have no idea where to even start.
Sounds complex,
Bucky said sympathetically. He had never studied engineering, so he couldn't figure out a way to help the boy. As he thought, the glint from his arm caught his eye, and Bucky had an idea.
Why don't you do something on prosthetic limbs? You could use my arm for a guide if you'd like.
The smile that lit up Peter's face was bright and had the power to wipe away all of Bucky's bad days. It was definitely something he wanted to see more of. That's awesome! Peter cried excitedly. Are you sure you don't mind, Mr. Bucky?
Just Bucky, kid.
Bucky replied with a fond shake of his head.
Do you want to work here or somewhere else?
Without answering, Peter gathered up his books and grabbed onto Bucky's flesh hand. The super soldier allowed himself to be pulled into the elevator by the excited teenager. Peter couldn't stop rambling excitedly about the topic, and Bucky just smiled. It was nice not to be treated like a ticking time bomb. Bucky was pulled into one of the labs and sat down where Peter directed him. He took off his jacket to allow Peter access to his arm. Okay, so I know the Princess of Wakanda made this, so there's probably nothing wrong. But is there something you'd want changed about your arm? Peter asked.
Yeah, Shuri did a pretty great job. My only complaint is that sometimes it pinches at the point it connects, and sometimes the braces can irritate my skin.
Bucky explained. Peter made diligent notes before putting his pen down and approaching. He cast a questioning look at Bucky, who just smiled at the teen. Peter began running his hands over Bucky's arm and turning the limb gently. He made his way up the limb until it came to the join. So it pinches here? Peter asked, and Bucky nodded. I wonder if a flesh-like polymer could be used to soften the connection point. But then you have to make sure that there is still nerve conduction getting to the limb. Peter's soft ramblings soothed Bucky, and he closed his eyes. As Peter moved about, mumbling, sketching and prodding, Bucky found himself dozing, something he never did around anyone else besides Steve, and occasionally Nat. Bucky, would you mind taking the arm off? Peter's voice drew Bucky out of his dozing state. I mean, you don't have to if it makes you uncomfortable. Bucky smiled again at the teen and reached up to unhook his arm. Peter cradled the prosthetic as though it were a piece of precious treasure, while Bucky gently rubbed his stump. May I? Peter asked, indicating to Bucky. The soldier nodded, and Peter gently touched the scarred appendage. How do you care for this?
Well, I wash it when I shower, obviously. Once Shuri had made me this arm. She gave me some lanolin cream to help keep the skin healthy. But after all the years of poor treatment, my skin reacts badly. So now I use mostly talcum powder and a moisturizing soap at night.
Bucky explained. Peter nodded and turned to make a few notes before focusing again on the limb. After about 20 minutes, Bucky heard the lab doors slide open. Looking over, he noticed Tony entering the lab and smiling fondly at Peter. Bucky attempted not to gasp and tense up.
This had to be Tony's lab! One of the places the rogues weren't meant to be! This would be enough for Tony to have him removed from the tower! The kid hadn't even noticed, but Bucky knew that he'd take the fall. It wasn't the kid's fault Bucky hadn't told him he wasn't allowed in here. Tony walked over to the table, and Bucky could see the surprise in his eyes when Tony noticed that Bucky's arm was off and Peter was examining it. The ex-assassin held his breath as Tony looked over at him, but relaxed slightly when Tony nodded in his direction. Hey there, Olaf,
Tony said, and Bucky rolled his eyes at the nickname. Hey, Mr. Stark, I'll just be a minute, Peter said as he took a few more notes and some final sketches, before turning back to Bucky. Okay, I think I'm done. Peter helped Bucky reattach his limb and smiled up at the man. Thank you so much, Bucky. You were so helpful, Peter said, and Bucky couldn't resist the urge to ruffle the teen's curls. As the soldier left the lab, he could only grin as Tony whined about Peter's use of Bucky's name. Later that same day, Bucky was reading a book on his bed when someone knocked on his door. He called the person in and sat up straight when Tony slipped inside.
Hey, Olaf.
Tony said, and Bucky nodded at him.
Can I sit?
Bucky nodded, and Tony sat down on the recliner that had been set up for Bucky to use while reading or watching TV in his room.
I'm sorry,
Bucky blurted out before Tony could say anything. The mechanic looked up at him with a raised eyebrow.
I didn't mean to go into your lab. It's not the kid's fault. I was just trying to help him with an assignment. It's my fault. Easy, Vance,
Tony said with that fond smile again on his face.
I didn't come in here to kick you out or anything. I wanted to thank you. Thank me? But I broke one of Miss Potter's rules,
Bucky said, and Tony laughed.
Pepper, Happy, and Rhodey just dictated those rules before I could even say a thing,
Tony said fondly with a shake of his head.
Don't stress. I wanted to thank you for helping the kid. He has problems with asking for help. Friday told me about his assignment, and I was just getting ready to confront him about it when he found you. He seems like a pretty great kid,
Bucky said, and Tony nodded. Bucky could see the pride radiating off of the man.
He is the best,
Tony replied.
He will be greater than all of us one day.
The two men sat in silence for a moment, before Tony slapped his hands against his knees and stood up.
Anyway, I just wanted to thank you again,
Tony said. He started to move, but a photo on Bucky's dresser caught his eye. It was one from the album of Bucky with his ma and sisters before he went off to war.
This is your mum, right?
Yeah, that's her. Bucky rose from the bed as he spoke, and moved slowly over to the other man.
Thank you for finding the jewelry and the photos. It means the world to me. Well, Hydra took both our mothers from us. The least I could do was give you yours back,
Tony said, and Bucky felt guilt well up in him.
Sorry, I can't give you yours back,
Bucky replied, and Tony turned to look at him. The soldier bowed his head, and he tensed up when Tony rested a hand on his shoulder.
It's all right, Bucky,
Tony said, and the other man looked up at his name.
I don't blame you. I blame Hydra. And knowing that we are working to destroy them is all I need. I have many fond memories of my mum, and I reflect on them rather than on her death. I know that she would have been proud of the changes I made in my life, and that's all I need to know. Still, I am eternally sorry,
Bucky said, and Tony nodded in understanding.
So, how did you get the photos and jewelry?
Your sister, Anna. Her daughter had all of it, Tony said, and Bucky frowned.
Has no one told you? You have a few living relatives still. I can send you their information if you'd like.
That day, Bucky found a new friend, in not only a teenager, but in the man who had tried to kill him once. 3 weeks after their first meeting, Peter came bursting into the communal kitchen where Bucky and Steve were having a cup of coffee. The teenager threw a black portfolio onto the table and indicated for Bucky to open it. As he did, he noticed that it was the report Peter had written on Bucky's arm, and plastered across the top of the cover page was a big red A+.
Well done, bud,
Bucky said proudly, and Peter blushed. Bucky ruffled the teen's curls, and Peter half-heartedly swiped at the older man's hand. Give me 2 more weeks and I'll be done, Peter said, and at Bucky's raised eyebrow he continued, with the upgrades you requested. I've just about got the polymer worked out and integrated. Mr. Stark is just helping me ensure that the nerve conduction is going to work. Bucky stared at the team for a minute before standing up and pulling Peter into a tight hug. As he softly whispered his gratitude into Peter's hair, Bucky vowed that no harm would come to this boy, ever. And if it did, the Winter Soldier would be coming out to play. Friday silently added another check mark to the scoreboard Tony had created. Peter Factor 7, Avengers & Co. 0. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. I've always loved that chapter. Bucky, I mean, that man has had one of the hardest lives so far, hasn't he? I mean, they've all had pretty shit lives, but God, he had literally had his whole life stolen from him and was forced to become a half-blood murderer. Anyway, I love his connection to Peter because in many fan fictions, it's not mentioned in this one, but in many fan fictions, Peter reminds Bucky of Steve when he was younger. Always getting into scraps and scrapes and Bucky putting him out of harm's way. And I just love that about it, and I love his connection to Tony as well. I mean, oh my god, these poor men. What can you do, right? Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe, and hit that bell to get notified for whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care.